Well, welcome everybody. Night like tonight, got some good stories, got some good friends sitting around this fire. See a lot of happy faces. Times are good, even in bad times we can make something happen. It's the human spirit, probably keeps this world rolling around. There's a lot of bad, unfortunately, but there's a whole lot of good. And one of the things that's good is being around people and sharing stories and laughing, telling jokes. Well, I don't have any real jokes for you right now, but I got some story. I want to tell some more of that Max Brand story. The one we've been reading. We're in book 3, The Seventh Man, and I'm up to about chapter 7, and that's where I'm going to start tonight. So y'all get settled, get something to drink, and let me tell this story. Chapter 7, Joan Disobeys. What he next knew was a fire of agony that wrapped his whole body, and consciousness flashed back on him. Strong arms lifted him up. Above him he sensed the eyes of his torturer, dim in moonlight, and he beat his clubbed left fist into that face. After that he knew he was being dragged onto a saddle, but a wave of pain rushed up his side and numbed his brain. Thereafter his senses returned by fits and starts, vaguely. Once he felt a steel cable that girdled his waist and breast that held him erect, though his head flopped back and forth. Once his eyes opened, and above him glittered the bright field of stars toward which he drifted through space, a mind without a body. Once a stab of torment wakened him enough to hear, "Easy, Satan. Watch them stones. One more jolt like that will send him clear to..." And the voice glided into an eternity of distance. Yet again he swung tip from a pit of darkness and became aware of a golden hair around a woman's face and a marvelous, soft, cool hand upon his forehead. Her voice reached him too, and made him think of all things musical, all things distant, like the sounds of birds falling from the sky, and though he understood not a syllable, a sweet assurance of safety flooded through him. He slept. When he awoke again, it was from the dream of fleeing through empty air swifter than the wind, with a wolf dog looming behind him out of space. But presently he found that he was lying in a bed with a stream of sunlight washing across a white coverlet. A door at his right swung open, and there in the entrance stood that wolf dog of his vision, with a 5-year-old girl upon its back. "Don't go in there, Bart," whispered the child. "Go on back." She took one of those pointed wolf ears in her chubby fist and tugged to swing him around. But Bart, with a speed which the eye could not follow, twisted his head, and the rows of great teeth closed over her hand. It was so horrible that the cry froze in the throat of Greg. Yet the child, with only a little murmur of anger, reached over with her other hand and caught that wolf by the nose. "Bad Bart," she whispered, and raised the hand which he instantly released. White marks showed on the pudgy tan. "Bad dog," she repeated, and beat his neck with an impotent little fist. The wolf dog cringed and turned from the door. "Come in," invited Greg. He was surprised to find his voice thin, apt to swing up to a high pitch beyond his control. A shower of golden curls tossed away from her face as she looked at him. "Oh," she cried, still with a guarded voice. She leaned far over, one hand buried in the ruff of Bart's neck to secure her balance, and with the other she laid hold of his right ear and drew him around, facing the door once more. This time he showed his teeth but submitted, only twitching his ear back and forth a time or two when she relaxed her hold. "Come in," repeated Greg. Well, she canted her head to one side and considered him with fearless blue eyes. "I want to," she sighed. "Well, why can't you, honey?" "Munner says no." He attempted to turn further towards her, but the pain in his right shoulder prevented it. He found that his arm was bandaged to the elbow and held close to his side by a complex swathing. Who is your mother? Asked Vic. Munner? She repeated, frowning in wonder. Why, Munner is my Munner. Oh, smiled he, and who is your pa? What? Who's your father? Who's your dad? Oh, Daddy Dan. You ask a lot of things, she said, disapprovingly. Come on in, pleaded Vic Gregg, and I won't ask nothing more about you. Munner says no, she repeated. She employed the moment of indecision by plucking at the hair of Bart's shoulders. He growled softly, terribly, but she paid not the slightest heed. Your mother won't care, asserted Vic. I know, she nodded, but Daddy will. Spanking? She looked blankly at him. Well, what will he do then if you come in to see me? He'll look at me. She grew breathless at the thought, and cast a guilty glance over her shoulder. Honey, chuckled Gregg weakly, I'll take all the blame. Just you come along in and he'll do his looking at me. He thought of that slender feller who had rescued him, with his large, gentle brown eyes. But to a child, even those mild eyes might seem terrible with authority. Will you? True? Said the child wistfully. Honest and true. All right. She made up her mind instantly, her face shining with excitement. Get up, Bart. And she thumped the wolf dog vigorously with her heels. He carried her in with a few gliding steps, soundless, except for the light rattle of claws on the floor. But he stopped well out of reach of the bed, and when Vic held his left hand as far as he could across his chest, Bart winced and gave a harsh warning. Vic had seen vicious dogs in his day, seen 'em fighting, seen 'em playing, but he'd never heard of one of them growl like this. The upper lips of the animal twitched dangerously back, and the sound came from the very depths of his body. It made the flesh crawl along Vic's back. One rip of those great teeth could tear a man's throat wide open. The child thudded her heels against the ribs of Bart again. Get up, she cried. The wolf dog shuddered, but would not budge an inch. Naughty Bart, she slipped off to the floor. I'll make him come, she says. If it's the same to you, said Vic, rather hastily, I'd just as soon he stayed where he is. He's got to do what I want, she answered. She shook a tiny forefinger at him. Bart, you just come here. The dog turned his blazing eyes on her and replied with a growl that shook his sides. Stop, she ordered, and struck him sharply on the nose. He blinked, and he lowered his head under the blow. But though the snarling stopped, his teeth flashed. She caught him by both jowls and tugged him forward. God, let him be, urged Vic. No, he's got to come. And come he did, step by halting step, while she hauled him, and now the snarling, hoarse intake of breath filled the room. Once she moved a little to one side, and Vic caught the glint of two eyes, red-stained, which were fixed undeviantly upon her face. Mixed with Vic's alarm at the great fighting beast was a peculiar uneasiness. For there was something uncanny in the determination, the fearlessness of this infant, and when she stepped away the wolf dog stood trembling, visibly, but his eyes were still not upon the man he hated or feared to approach, but upon the child's face. Can you pat him now? She asked, but not for an instant, turning to Gregg. No, but it's close enough, he assured her. I don't want him no closer. He's got to come, she stamped. Bart, you come here. He flinched forward an inch. Bart! Her hands were clenched and her little body quivered with resolution. That snake-like head came to the very edge of the bed. Now pat him, she commanded. By very unpleasant degrees, Vic stretched his hand towards that growling menace. He'll take my arm off, he complained. Shame kept him from utterly refusing the risk. He won't bite you one bit, declared that child, but I'll hold his nose if you're afraid, and instantly she grabbed that pointed muzzle between her hands. Even when Vic's hand hovered above his head, Bart had no eye for him, could not divert his gaze from the face of the child. Once, twice, and again, delicately as one might handle bubbles, Gregg touched that scarred forehead. I made him come, didn't I? She cried in triumph and turned a tense little face towards Vic. But the instant her eyes moved, that wolf dog leaped away half the width of the room and stood shivering, more devilish than ever. She stamped again. Bad Bart, she said angrily. Shall I make him come again? Leave him be, muttered Vic, closing his eyes. Leave him where he is. I don't want him. Oh, she said. Well, it's hard to make him do things sometimes, but Daddy Dan can make him do anything. Huh, grunted Vic. He was remembering now. At the master's order, Bart had crouched at his feet in the woods. An unchained murderer, hungrily waiting for an excuse to kill. There was something very odd about the people of this house, and it would be a long time before he rid himself of the impression of the cold, steady eyes which had flashed up to him a moment before out of that baby face. Joan, called a voice from beyond, and the soft fiber of it made Vic certain that it belonged to the rider of the black stallion. The little girl ran a step towards the door and then stopped and shrank back against the bed. If you're afraid your dad'll find you here, said Vic, you just run along. She was nervously twisting her hands in her dress. Daddy Dan'll know, she whispered without turning, and he won't let me be afraid, even of him. A small hand slipped up, fumbled a bit, found the thumb of Vic Gregg, and closed softly over it. With this to steady her, she waited, facing the door. Chapter 8, Discipline. A light step crossed the outer room, with something peculiar in its lightness, as if the heels were not touching the floor, with the effect of the padded fall of the feet of some great cats. There was both softness and the sense of weight. First, the wolf dog pricked his ears and turned towards the door. A pudgy fist closed convulsively over Vic's thumb, and then his rescuer stood in the entrance. Hello, partner, called Vic. I got company, you see. The door blew open, and I asked your little girl in. I told you not to come here, said the other. Vic felt that child tremble, but there was no burst of excuses. She didn't want to come, he urged, but I kept on asking her. The emotionless eyes of Daddy Dan held upon Joan. I told you not to come, he said. Joan swallowed in mute agony, and the wolf dog slipped to the side of the master and licked his hand, as though in dumb intercession. The blood ran coldly in the veins of Gregg, as if he saw a fist raised to strike the little girl. You go out. She went swiftly at that, slided past her father with her eyes lifted, fascinated, and so out the door where she paused an instant to flash back a wistful appeal. Nothing but silence, and then her feet pattering off into the outer room. Maybe you better go keep her company, Bart, said the father, and at this sign of relenting, Vic felt his tensed muscles relaxing. The wolf whined softly and glided through the door. You feeling better? Like a hoss off green feed. I've been lying here drinking up the sunshine. The other stood beside the open window where he canted his head, his glance far off and intent. Do you hear? He asked, turning sharply. There was a fierce eagerness in his face. Hear what? It's spring, he murmured, without answering more directly than this, and Vic felt that the other had changed again, grown understandable. Nevertheless, the shock of that sudden alteration at the window kept him watching his host with breathless interest. Whatever it was that strange fellow heard, a light had gleamed in his eyes for a moment. As he sauntered back towards the bed, just a trace of it lingered about him, a hint of sternness. Spring? Answered Gregg. Yup, I smelled spring a few days back, and I started out to find some action. You can see for yourself that I found it, partner. He stirred uneasily. But it was necessary that the story should be told, lest it reach the ears of this man from another source. It was one thing to shelter a fugitive from justice whose crime was unknown, perhaps trifling, but it might be quite another story if this gentle, singular man learned that his guest was a new-made murderer. Better he should learn the tale now and form his prejudices in favor of Greg. "I'll tell you the whole story," he began. But the other shrugged his shoulders. "You leave the story be," he said, and there was something in the quiet firmness of his manner which made it impossible for Vic to continue. "You're here, and you're hurt, and you need a pile of rest. That's about enough for me." Vic put himself swiftly in the place of the other. Suppose that he and Betty Neal should have a cabin off in the mountains like this. How would they receive a wounded fugitive from justice? And unquestioningly as this? In a surge of gratitude, he looked mistily toward his host. "Stranger," he said, "my name's Vic Gregg, and I come from—" "Thanks," cut in the other. "I'm glad to know your name, but in case anybody might be asking me, I wouldn't care to know where you come from," he smiled. "I'm Dan Barry." It had to be a left-handed shake on the part of Vic, a thing of which he often thought in the days that followed, but now he sent his memory hunting. "Seems like I've heard your name before," he murmured. "I don't know where. Were you ever around Alder, Barry?" "No." His manner suggested the topic might as well be closed. He reached over and he dropped his hand lightly on the forehead of Vic. A tingling current flowed from it into the brain of the wounded man. "Your blood still a little bit hot," he said. "Lie quiet and don't even think. You're safe here. There ain't a thing going to get at you, not a thing. You'll stay till you get ready to leave. So long. I'll see that you get something to eat." He went out with that unusual padding step, which Vic had noticed before, and closed the door softly behind him. In spite of that barrier, Greg could hear the noises from the next room quite clearly, as someone brought in wood and dropped it on the stone hearth, rattling. He fell into a pleasant daze, just stretching his body now and then to enjoy the coolness of the sheets, the delicious sense of being cared for, and the returning strength in his muscles. Through that haze he heard voices, presently, which called him back to wakefulness. That ought to be good for him. Take it in, Kate. "I shall, Dan." "What has Joan done?" "She went in there. I told her to leave him alone." "But she says he asked her to come in. Said he would take the blame." "I told her not to go." "Poor baby. She's outside now, weeping her eyes out on Bart's shoulder, and he's trying to comfort her." It was purer English than Vic was accustomed to hear, even from his schoolmistress. But more than the words, the voice surprised him, the low, controlled voice of a woman of gentle blood. He turned his head and he looked out the window, baffled. Far above, shooting out of sight, went the slope of a mountain. A cliff shining in the slant sun of the afternoon here, a tumble slide of rocks and debris there. Why should a girl of refinement choose the isolation of such a place as this for her home? It was not the only strange thing about this household, however, and he would dismiss conjectures until he was once more on his feet. She was saying, "Won't you speak to her now?" A little pause, then, "No, not till evening. Please, Dan. She's got to learn." A little exclamation of unhappiness, then the door moved open. Vic found himself looking up to the face with the golden hair which he remembered out of his nightmare. She nodded to him cheerily. "Well, I'm so happy that you're better," she said. "Dan says that the fever's nearly gone." She rested a large tray she carried on the foot of the bed, and Vic discovered, to his great content, that it was not hard to meet her eyes. Usually girls embarrassed him, but he recognized so much of Joan in the features of the mother that he felt well acquainted at once. Motherhood, surely, sat as lightly on her shoulders as fatherhood did on Dan Barry. Yet he felt a great pity as he looked at her, this flower-like beauty, lost in the rocks and the snow with only one man near her. She was like music played without an audience except senseless things. "Yep, I'm a lot better," he answered, "but it sure makes me terrible sorry, ma'am, that I get your little girl in trouble. Mostly it was my fault." She waved away all need of apology. "Don't think an instant about that, Mr. Gregg. Joan needs a great deal of disciplining." She laughed a little. "She has so much of her father in her, you see. Now, are you strong enough to lift yourself higher in the pillows?" They managed it between them, for he was weaker than he thought, and when he was patted into position with the cushions, she laid the tray across his knees. His head swam at the sight of it. 48 hours of fasting had sharpened his appetite, and the loaded tray whetted a razor edge, for a great bowl of broth steamed forth an exquisite fragrance on one side, and beside it she'd lifted a napkin to let him peek at a slice of venison steak. Then there was butter, yellow as the gold for which he'd been digging all winter, and real cream for his coffee, a whole pitcher of it, and snowy bread. Best of all, she did not stay to embarrass him, with her watching while he ate, since above all things in the world a hungry man hates observation when the board is spread. Afterwards, consuming sleep rippled over him from his feet to his eyes to his brain. He partially roused when the tray was removed and the pillows slipped from under his back, but with a vague understanding that expert hands were setting the bed in order, his senses fled once more. Hours and hours later he opened his eyes in utter darkness, with a thin, sweet voice still ringing in his ears. He could not place himself, until he turned his head and saw a meager, broken, rectangular line of light, which was the door. And immediately afterwards the voice cried, "Oh, Daddy Dan, and what did the wolf do then?" "I'm coming to that, Joan, but don't you talk about wolves so loud or old Black Bart'll think you're talking about him. See him looking at you now?" "But please go on. I won't say one little word." The man's voice began again, softly, so that not a word was audible to Greg. He heard the crackle of burning logs upon the hearth and saw the rectangle of light flicker. He caught a faint set of wood smoke, and then he went to sleep again. Chapter 9, The Long Arm of the Law. From the very first, the wound healed rapidly, for Vic's blood was perfectly pure, the mountain air a tonic which strengthened him, and his food and care of the very best. The high-powered rifle bullet whipped cleanly through his shoulder, breaking no bone, tearing no ligament, and the flesh closed swiftly. Even Vic's mind carried no burden to oppress him in care for the future or regret for the past. For if he occasionally remembered the limp body of Hanson on the floor of Captain Lorimer's, he would shrug the picture into oblivion. It had been a fair fight, man to man, with all the odds in favor of Blondie, who had been allowed to pull his gun first. If Vic thought about the future at all, it was with a blind confidence that sometime and in some unraveled way he would get away to Alder and he would marry Betty Neal. But in the meantime, as the days of spring went mildly by, he was up and about, and very soon there was only a little stiffness in his right arm to remind him of Pete Glass and that dusty roan. He spent most of the time close to the cabin, for though he had forgotten the world, there was no decisive proof that the world would forget him half so easily. That was not the way of this sheriff. He had been known to spend years in the hunt for a single misdoer, and Vic had no care to wander out where he might be seen. Besides, very pleasant about the cabin. The house itself was built solidly, roomily, out of logs hewn on the timbered slope above and dragged down to this little plateau. 3 mountains to the north, south, and west rolled back and up, cutting away the sunlight in the early afternoon. But at this point, the quick slopes put out shoulders and made, among them, a comfortable bit of rolling ground, deep-soiled and fertile. Here, so Kate Barry assured him, the wildflowers came even earlier than they did in the valley so far below them, and to be sure, when Vic first walked from the house, he found the meadow aflame with color, except for the space covered by the truck garden and the corral. And in that enclosure he found Gray Molly fenced away from the black with several other horses of commoner blood, for the stallion, he learned, recognized no fraternity of horseflesh, but killed what he could reach. Gray Molly was quite recovered from her long run, and she greeted him in her familiar ways, with ears flattened viciously. He might have stayed on here quite happily for any space of time, but more and more Vic felt that he was an intruder. He sensed it, rather than received a hint of word or eye. In the first place, the three were complete in themselves, a triangle of happiness without the need of another member for variety or interest. It was plain at a glance that the girl was wholeheartedly happy, and whatever incongruity lay between her and those rough mountains, he began to understand that her love for Barry and that child made ample amends. As for the other two, he always thought of them in the same instant, for if the child had her eyes and her hair from her mother, she had her nature from the man. They were together constantly, on walks up the mountain, when she rode Black Bart up that steep places, on dips into the valley when he carried her before him on the stallion. She had the same soft voice, the same quick, furtive ways, the same soundless laughter at times. And when Barry sat in the evening, as he often did for hours, staring at empty air, she would climb on his knee, place his unresisting arms around her, and she, looking up into his face, sharing his silence. Sometimes Vic wondered if the young mother were not troubled and made a little jealous by this perfect companionship, but he never found a trace of it. It was she, finally, who made him determined to leave as soon as his shoulder muscles moved with perfect freedom. For as the days slipped past, he felt that she grew more and more uneasy, and her eyes had a way of going from him to her husband as though she believed their guest a constant danger to Barry. Indeed, to some small extent he was a danger, for the law might deal heartily with a man who took a fugitive out of the very grip of its hands. By a rather ironical chance, on the very morning when he decided that he must start his journey the next day but one, Vic learned that he must not linger even so long as that. Pete Glass and the law had not forgotten him, indeed, nearly so well as he had forgotten the law and Pete Glass. For he sat in his room filling a pipe after breakfast. The voice of Barry called him out, and he found his host among the rocks which rimmed the southern end of the plateau, in front of the house. To the north, the ground fell away smoothly, rolled down the side of the mountain, then dipped easily to the valley, the only direction from which the cabin was accessible, though here the grade was possible for a buckboard. Now to the south, the plateau ended in a drop that angled sharply down, almost a cliff in places, and from this point of vantage the eye carried nameless miles down the river. "Are them friends of yours?" asked Dan Barry as he stood among those rocks. "Take a long look." And he handed a strong pair of field glasses to Greg. The latter peered over that dizzy edge, and down there, in the very act of fording the river to get to their side of it, he marked 5 horsemen. No, 6, for he almost missed the leader of the troop, a dusty figure which melted into the background. All the terror of the first flight rushed back on Vic. He stood palsied, not in fear of that posse, but at the very thought of pursuit. "There's only one way," he stammered at length. Dan, give me my hand to get a saddle on Grey Molly, and I'll laugh at him yet. Damn him!" "What are you going to do?" It was the same unhurried voice which had spoken to Vic on the day of his rescue, and it irritated him in the same manner now. Kate had come running from the house with her apron fluttering. "I'm going down that slope to the north," said Vic, "and I'll get by 'em hell-bent for election. Once I show my heels to that lot, they're done." He talked as much to restore his courage as from confidence, for if that posse sighted him going down that slope on the Grey, it would take a super horseman and a super horse to escape before they closed that gap. Barry considered the situation with a new gleam in his eye. "Wait a minute," he said, as Vic started towards the corral. "That way you got planned is a good way to die. You listen to me." But here Kate broke in on them. "Dan, what are you going to do?" "I'm going to take the Grey and go down the slope, and I'm going to lead him off Vic's trail," said Barry quietly. But it seemed to Vic that he avoided his wife's eyes. The voice of Betty Neal, Vic knew, would have risen shrill at a time like this. Kate spoke even more low than usual, but there was a thing in her voice that struck a tremor through Greg. "If it's death for him, what is it for you?" "Nothing at all. If they see me and head for me before the way's clear, I'll let 'em come up and see that they have the wrong man. If I get the chance, I'll lead 'em away. And Vic, you'll hit between those 2 mountains. You see 'em? And cut across country. No hoss could carry you except Satan, and you couldn't ride him. You'll have to go on foot, but they'll never look for you on that side. And when you get up to the easy going down in the valley, buy a hoss and hit for the railroad." Kate turned on Vic, trembling. "Are you going to let him do it?" she said. "Are you going to let him do it again?" He had seen a certain promise of escape held before him the moment before, but pride made him throw that certainty away. "Not in a million years," he answered. "You'll do what I say and you'll start now. I got a better idea than that. If you head just over the side of that north mountain, you'll find a path that a hoss can follow. It won't take you clear away from them down below, but there ain't a chance in 10 that they'll come that way. Take my old brown hoss with the white face. He'll carry you safe." Vic hesitated. The fierce eyes of Kate were on him, and with all his soul he wanted to play the man. But liberty was sweet, sweeter than ever to Vic. She seemed to give him up as he stood there with his heart in his throat. She turned back to Barry. "Dan," she pleaded. She had not touched him, but he made a vague gesture as though brushing away a restraining hand. She cried, "If you come close to them, if they start shooting, you might want to fight back." "They shot before," he answered, "and I didn't fire once. But the second time? To be sure, there would be danger in it. But as Barry himself had said, if the way was closed to him, he could surrender to them. And if they would not harm him—" Vic tried in vain to understand this overmastering terror in the girl, for she seemed more afraid of what Dan might do to the posse than what the posse might do to Dan. "This ain't a day for fighting," said Dan, and he waved towards the mountains. It was one of those misty spring days when the sun raises a vapor from the earth and the cloud blows low around the upper peaks. Every ravine was poured full of blue shadows, and even high up in the slopes where patches of snow had melted, grass glimmered a tender green among the white. "Yeah, this ain't a day for fighting," he repeated. A shrill, quavering neigh, like the whinny of a galloping horse, ran back along the house, and Vic saw that black stallion racing up and down his corral. Back and forth he wove, then raced straight for the bars, flashed above him, and stood free beyond, with the sunshine trembling on him. He seemed to pause, wondering what to do with his new freedom. Then he came at a loose gallop for the master. Not Satan alone, for now Black Bart slid along the plateau like a shadow, weaving among the boulders, and came straight towards Barry. Vic himself felt a change, a sort of uneasy happiness. He breathed it with the air. The very sunlight was electric. He saw Kate run close to Barry. "If you go this time, you'll never come back, Dan." The black stallion swung up beside them. As he halted, the hoofs knocked a rattling spray of pebbles ahead of him. And on the other side of the woman and the man, the wolf dog ran uneasily here and there, trying to watch the face of the master, which Kate obscured. "I ain't going far. I just want to get a hoss running under me enough to cut a wind. Even Satan and Bart feel what I mean. They came without being called. They never do that unless there's danger ahead. What can I do to convince you? Dan, you'll drive me mad." He made no answer, and if that girl wished him to stay, now seemed the time for persuasion. But she gave up that argument suddenly. She turned away, and Vic saw in her face that same desperate, helpless look as that of a boy who cannot swim beyond his depth in the river. There was no sign of tears. They might come afterwards. What had come over them? This desperation in Kate, this touch of anxiety in the very horse and the wolf dog. Vic forgot his own danger while he stared, and it seemed to him that the spark of change had come from Barry. There was something in his eyes which Vic found hard to meet. "The moment you came, I knew you brought bad luck with you," cried Kate. "He brought you in bleeding. He saved you and came in with blood on his hands, and I guessed at the end. Oh, I wish you—" "Kate," broke in Barry. She dropped upon one of the stones and buried her face in her hands, and Dan paid no more attention to her. "Hurry up," he said. "They're across the river." And Vic gave up the struggle, for the tears of Kate made him think of Betty Neal, and he followed Dan towards the corral. Around them the stallion ran like a hunting dog, eager to be off. Well, it kind of looks like we're building up to a chase or a gunfight or something fun. Yeah. And we'll talk about that part of the story next time I see you. Next time I see you here around the campfire. It'll be fun. Always is. Come and see me. Until then, this is Clay Steele. Goodbye.